Okay, continuing to read The Order of Things by Michel Foucault, Chapter 9, Part 5, called The Cogito and the Unthought. If man is indeed in the world the locus of an empirico-transcendental doublet, if he is that paradoxical figure in which the empirical contents of knowledge necessarily release of themselves the conditions that have made them possible, then man cannot posit himself in the immediate and sovereign transparency of a cogito, nor, on the other hand, can he inhabit the objective inertia of something that, by rights, does not and never can lead to self-consciousness. Man is a mode of being which accommodates that dimension, always open, never finally delimited, yet constantly traversed, which extends from a part of himself not reflected in a cogito to the act of thought by which he apprehends that part, and which, in the inverse direction, extends from that pure apprehension to the empirical clutter, the chaotic accumulation of contents, the weight of experiences constantly eluding themselves, the whole silent horizon of what is posited in the sandy stretches of non-thought. Because he is an empirico-transcendental doublet, man is also the locus of misunderstanding that constantly exposes his thought to the risk of being swamped by his own being, and also enables him to recover his integrity on the basis of what eludes him. This is why transcendental reflection in its most modern form does not, as in Kant, find its fundamental necessity in the existence of a science of nature, opposed by the perpetual conflicts and uncertainties of philosophers, but in the existence mute, yet ready to speak, and secretly impregnated with a potential discourse of that non-known from which man is perpetually summoned towards self-knowledge. The question is no longer, how can experience of nature give rise to necessary judgments? But rather, how can man think what he does not think, inhabit as though by a mute occupation something that eludes him, animate with a kind of frozen movement that figure of himself that takes the form of a stubborn exteriority? How can man be that life whose web, pulsations, and buried energy constantly exceed the experience that he is immediately given of them? How can he be that labor whose laws and demands are imposed upon him like some alien system? How can he be the subject of a language that for thousands of years has been formed without him? A language whose organization escapes him, whose meaning sleeps an almost invincible sleep in the words he momentarily activates by means of discourse, and within which he is obliged from the very outset to lodge his speech and thought, as though they were doing no more than animate, for a brief period, one segment of that web of innumerable possibilities. There has been a fourfold displacement in relation to the Kantian position, for it is now a question not of truth, but of being, not of nature, but of man, not of the possibility of understanding, but of the possibility of a primary misunderstanding, not of the unaccountable nature of philosophical theories as opposed to science, but of the resumption in a clear philosophical awareness of that whole realm of unaccounted for experiences in which man does not recognize himself. Given this displacement of the question of transcendence, contemporary thought could not avoid reviving the theme of the cogito. Was it not also on the basis of error, illusion, dreams, and madness, all the experiences of unaccounted for thought, that Descartes discovered the impossibility of there not being thoughts? To such effect that the thought of the ill thought, of the non-true, of the chimerical, of the purely imaginary, emerged as the possible locus and the primary irrefutable proof of all those experiences. But the modern cogito is as different from Descartes as our notion of transcendence is remote from Kantian analysis. For Descartes was concerned to reveal thought as the most general form of all those thoughts we term error or illusion, thereby rendering them harmless so that he would be free. Once that step had been taken, to return to them, to explain them, and then to provide a method of guarding against them. In the modern cogito, on the other hand, we are concerned to grant the highest value, the greatest dimension, to the distance that both separates and links thought conscious of itself and whatever within thought is rooted in non-thought. The modern cogito, and this is why it is not so much the discovery of an evident truth as a ceaseless task, constantly to be undertaken afresh, must traverse, duplicate, and reactivate in an explicit form the articulation of thought on everything within it, around it, and beneath it, which is not thought, yet which is nevertheless not foreign to thought, in the sense of an irreducible, an insuperable exteriority. In this form, the cogito will not therefore be the sudden and illuminating discovery that all thought is thought, but the constantly renewed interrogation as to how thought can reside elsewhere than here, and yet so very close to itself. How it can be in the forms of non-thinking. The modern cogito does not reduce the whole being of things to thought without ramifying the being of thought right down to the inert network of what does not think. This double movement proper to the modern cogito explains why the I think does not, in its case, lead to the evident truth of the I am. Indeed, as soon as the I think has shown itself to be embedded in a density throughout which it is quasi-present, and which it animates, though in an equivocal, semi-dormant, semi-wakeful fashion, it is no longer possible to make it lead on to the affirmation, I am. For can I, in fact, say that I am this language I speak, into which my thought insinuates itself to the point of finding in it the system of all its own possibilities, yet which exists only in the weight of sedimentations my thoughts will never be capable of actualizing altogether? Can I say that I am this labor I perform with my hands, yet which eludes me not only when I have finished it, but even before I have begun it? Can I say that I am this life I sense deep within me, but which envelops me both in the irresistible time that grows side by side with it and poses me for a moment on its crest, and in the imminent time that prescribes my death? I can say equally well that I am and that I am not all this. The cogito does not lead to an affirmation of being, but it does lead to a whole series of questions concerned with being. What must I be, I who think and who am my thought, in order to be what I do not think, in order for my thought to be what I am not? What is this being, then, that shimmers and, as it were, glitters in the opening of the cogito? Yet it is, yet is not sovereignly given in it or by it. What then is the connection, the difficult link between being and thought? What is man's being? And how can it be that being, which could so easily be characterized by the fact that it has thoughts and is possibly alone in having them, has an ineradicable and fundamental relation to the unthought, a form of reflection is established far removed from both Cartesianism and Kantian analysis, a form that involves, for the first time, man's being in that dimension where thought addresses the unthought and articulates itself upon it. This has two consequences. The first is negative and of a purely historical order. It may seem that phenomenology has effected a union between the Cartesian theme of the cogito and the transcendental motif that Kant had derived from Hume's critique. According to this view, Husserl has revived the deepest vocation of the Western ratio, bending it back upon itself in a reflection which is a radicalization of pure philosophy and a basis for the possibility of its own history. In fact, Husserl was able to effect this union only insofar as transcendental analysis had changed its point of application. The latter has shifted from the possibility of a science of nature to the possibility for man to conceive of himself. And insofar as the cogito had modified its function, which is no longer to lead to an apodictic existence, starting from a thought that affirms itself wherever it thinks, but to show how thought can elude itself and thus lead to a many-sided and proliferating interrogation concerning being. Phenomenology is therefore much less the resumption of an old rational goal of the West than the sensitive and precisely formulated acknowledgement of the great hiatus that occurred in the modern episteme at the turn of the 18th and 19th centuries. If phenomenology has any allegiance, it is to the discovery of life, work, and language, and also to the new figure which, under the old name of man, first appeared less than 2 centuries ago. It is to interrogation concerning man's mode of being and his relation to the unthought. This is why phenomenology, even though it was first suggested by way of anti-psychologism, or rather precisely insofar as in opposition to anti-psychologism, it revived the problem of the a priori and the transcendental motif, has never been able to exercise its insidious kinship, its simultaneously promising and threatening proximity to empirical analysis of man. It is also why, though it was inaugurated by a reduction to the cogito, it has always been led to questions, to the question of ontology. The phenomenological project continually resolves itself of actual experience and into an ontology of the unthought that automatically short-circuits the primacy of the I think. The second consequence is a positive one. It concerns the relation of man to the unthought, or more precisely, their twin appearance in Western culture. It seems obvious enough that from the moment when man first constituted himself as a positive figure in the field of knowledge, the old privilege of reflexive knowledge, of thought thinking itself, could not but disappear. But that it became possible by this very fact for an objective form of thought to investigate man in his entirety, at the risk of discovering what could never be reached by his reflection, or even by his consciousness. Dim mechanisms, faceless determinations, a whole landscape of shadow that has been termed, directly or indirectly, the unconscious. For is not the unconscious what necessarily yields itself up to the scientific thought man applies to himself, when he ceases to conceive of himself in the form of reflection? As a matter of fact, the unconscious and the forms of the unthought in general have not been the reward granted to a positive knowledge of man. Man and the unthought are, at the archaeological level, contemporaries. Man has not been able to describe himself as a configuration in the episteme without thought, at the same time discovering both in himself and outside himself at its borders, yet also in its very warp and woof, an element of darkness, an apparently inert density in which it is embedded, an unthought which it contains entirely, yet in which it is also caught. The unthought, whatever name we give it, is not lodged in man like a shriveled up nature or a stratified history. It is in relation to man the other that is not only a brother but a twin, born not of man nor in man, but beside him, and at the same time in an identical newness, in an unavoidable duality. This obscure space, readily interpreted as an abyssal region in man's nature, or as a uniquely impregnable fortress in his history, is linked to him in an entirely different way. It is both exterior to him and indispensable to him. In one sense, the shadow cast by man as he emerged in the field of knowledge. In another, the blind stain by which it is possible to know him. In any case, the unthought has accompanied man mutely and uninterruptedly since the 19th century, since it was really never more than an insistent double. It has never been the object of reflection in an autonomous way. It has received the complementary form and the inverted name of that for which it was the other and the shadow. In Hegelian phenomenology, it was the an-sich as opposed to the für-sich. For Schopenhauer, it was the unbewusst. For Marx, it was alienated man. In Husserl's analysis, it was the implicit, the inactual, the sedimented, the non-effected. In every case, the inexhaustible double that presents itself to reflection as the blurred projection of what man is in his truth, but that also plays the role of a preliminary ground upon which man must collect himself and recall himself in order to attain his truth. For though this double may be close, it is alien, and the role, the true undertaking of thought will be to bring it as close to itself as possible. The whole of modern thought is imbued with the necessity of thinking the unthought, of reflecting the contents of the in itself in the form of the for itself, of ending man's alienation by reconciling him with his own essence, of making explicit the horizon that provides experience with its background of immediate and disarmed proof, of lifting the veil of the unconscious, of becoming absorbed in its silence, or of straining to catch its endless murmur. In modern experience, the possibility of establishing man within knowledge and the mere emergence of this new figure in the field of the episteme imply an imperative that haunts thought from within. It matters little whether it be given currency in the form of ethics, politics, humanism, a duty to assume responsibility for the fate of the West, or the mere consciousness of performing in history a bureaucratic function. What is essential is that thought, both for itself and in the density of its workings, should be both knowledge and a modification of what it knows, reflection and a transformation of the mode of being of that on which it reflects. Whatever it touches, it immediately causes to move. It cannot discover the unthought, or at least move towards it, without immediately bringing the unthought nearer to itself, or even, perhaps, without pushing it further away, and in any case without causing man's own being to undergo a change by that very fact, since it is deployed in the distance between them. There is something here profoundly bound up with our modernity. Apart from its religious moralities, it is clear that the West has known only two ethical forms. The old one, in the form of Stoicism or Epicureanism, was articulated upon the order of the world, and by discovering the law of that order, it could deduce from it the principle of a code of wisdom or a conception of the city. Even the political thought of the 18th century still belongs to this general form. The modern one, on the other hand, formulates no morality, since any imperative is lodged within thought, and its movement towards the apprehension of the unthought. It is reflection, the act of consciousness, the elucidation of what is silent, language restored to what is mute, the illumination of the element of darkness that cuts man off from himself. The reanimation of the inert. It is all this, and this alone, that constituted the content and form of the ethical. Modern thought has never, in fact, been able to propose a morality. But the reason for this is not because it is pure speculation. On the contrary, modern thought, from its inception and in its very density, is a certain mode of action. Let those who urge thought to leave its retreat and to formulate its choices talk on, and let those who seek without any pledge and in the absence of virtue to establish a morality do as they wish. For modern thought, no morality is possible. Thought had already left itself in its own being as early as the 19th century. It is no longer theoretical. As soon as it functions, it offends or reconciles, attracts or repels, breaks, dissociates, unites or reunites. It cannot help but liberate and enslave. Even before prescribing, suggesting a future, saying what must be done, even before exhorting or merely sounding an alarm, thought, at the level of its existence, in its very dawning, is in itself an action, a perilous act. Sade, Nietzsche, Artaud, and Bataille have understood this on behalf of all those who tried to ignore it. But it is also certain that Hegel, Marx, and Freud knew it. Can we say that it is not known by those who, in their profound stupidity, assert that there is no philosophy without political choice? That all thought is either progressive or reactionary? Their foolishness is to believe that all thought expresses the ideology of a class. Their involuntary profundity is that they point directly at the modern mode of being of thought. Superficially, one might say that knowledge of man, unlike the sciences of nature, is always linked, even in its vaguest forms, to ethics or politics. More fundamentally, modern thought is advancing towards that region where man's other must become the same as himself. That's the end of part 5 of chapter 9 of The Order of Things by Michel Foucault.